The April-May-June series. Book 1. A World Apart. Chapter 1. Lost and Found. Run. As fast as you can. Faster, April. Hide somewhere. Anywhere, quickly. The voice telling her what to do was her own, as if she didn't already know. I am. She cried impatiently and ran, as fast as she could, searching the forest for somewhere to hide. Anywhere. There was certainly no time to stand and argue with herself. Unless she had a strong desire to be eaten alive. Some days, she might have welcomed such a fate. But this was not one of those days. Her feet flew as though they had wings, barely touching the ground before launching into space again. Dusk was falling too fast. She could barely see. Dark shadows loomed up to block her path. How was she going to find somewhere to hide? Before it was too late. The great white owl circling overhead had the advantage, it could see just fine in the night. It couldn't wait to snatch her up for supper, as if she was a common field mouse. She might be small for an elf, but she was no mouse. Maybe the scrap of fur she wore to prevent from freezing to death was misleading the bird. Or maybe the bird didn't care either way. A meal was a meal. It certainly wasn't interested in discussing the matter. April spied a stark silhouette. The final rays of daylight glinted off the white froth of a fast-rushing creek, and reflected straight through the center of a hollow log, perched rather precariously on the raised bank. Shelter. If she could make it inside. Abruptly changing direction, she ducked and lunged into the log. And not a moment too soon. She felt the rush of wind, and perhaps even a brush of feathers on her toes, as the owl swooped down to scoop her up. April tumbled headfirst into the log and skidded to a stop. It certainly wasn't the cleanest, driest hollow log she had ever visited. It was actually kind of slimy, and smelly and small. But it had just saved her life, so she wasn't going to complain. April scurried deeper. She strained her pointed ears. Nothing. The next minute felt like an hour. Still nothing. Surely the owl had not given up so easily. Of course not, April muttered wearily, when a loud flapping signaled the bird's return. It was followed by the sharp scrape of talons on wood. The log lurched violently. April was thrown against one rotted side. Worse yet, the wood was moving. Her sanctuary was completely infested with creepy slimy things. April barely had a chance to shriek before the owl tried again. This time the log didn't merely lurch. It rolled forward, and it kept on rolling downhill. It crunched over the last bits of winter ice and picked up speed, spinning her in violent circles. Her haven had become a trap. When the log finally stopped, she again hit the wall of moving slime. Gross. So gross. April yelled, trying to push away. Her hand closed around a squishy grub. She didn't have to see it to know what it was. She might have leapt right out of the log of horrors then, except it started moving again, in a different way, more like a bobbing boat. An icy splash of water through the opening confirmed it. She was taking a trip down the swollen creek, whether she wanted to or not. And I don't, she sighed, just to be clear with herself. Finding somewhere to sit that wasn't pooled with ice water, or squirming beneath her, proved impossible. Just sit down and shut up. It's better than being bird food, she muttered and chose the ice water. She couldn't get any wetter or colder. April slumped down and sneezed, simply too defeated to worry about where the log was taking her. She couldn't stop it, she could only go along for the ride. How had she gotten into such a predicament? Things like this were happening all too often lately. She was obviously becoming careless. 5 years alone in the forest was simply 5 years too long. 5 freezing winters, 5 soaking springs, 5 bug-infested summers, and 5 wildly windy autumns too long. If she didn't find other elves soon, she probably would get eaten. Well, at least it would put her out of her misery. And the longer she traveled through the forest alone, the more miserable she became. Some days she couldn't stand her own company. Some days, if she could have left herself behind, she would have done it in a second. Maybe the myth she had been told as a child, about other elves living in the West, was merely that, a myth. Maybe she had spent years walking west for nothing except sore feet. It was entirely possible that there were no more elves left in the world, only her. The last elf, April said to herself. They were such sad words. More discouraged than ever, she hugged her knees against the chill and clamped her hand around the gold tag she wore on a chain about her neck. She ran her finger lightly over the engraved letters. It helped her to remember who she was. April, May, June, 14. Her name and age. She would turn 15 soon, if she lasted that long. She always knew when it was her birthday, April the 1st, because her tag got hot against her skin, and the number changed magically. Her birthdate helped to explain the first part of her ridiculous name. April never had a chance to ask her parents about her name. They had been gone forever before she was old enough to converse intelligently or wonder about things like being named after not merely 1 month, but 3. And she had spent her past 5 birthdays alone. The way this year was unfolding, her upcoming birthday would be nothing but one more solitary day, with no berry cake or songs. The log continued to speed through the night. April dozed on and off, until the ride became much rougher. She picked some of the more adventurous larvae off her legs and cautiously leaned out to take a peek. The sky was tinged with orange. It was barely morning. The creek was white-capped, whipped into a frenzy. She pulled back inside, and not a moment too soon. The bottom fell out of her world, so to speak. Suddenly, April in her log was falling through space. The water sounded more like thunder. She was inside one monster of a waterfall. April screamed and grabbed at the walls. There was nothing to hold onto at all. The log reached bottom and bounced. A torrent of ice water surged through its hollow center, trying to flush it clean. April anchored herself in the log by spreading her arms wide and pressing with all her strength. It felt like she was lodged in the belly of a giant fish that was determined to spew her out. By the time the log bobbed free of the bottom of the waterfall, and drained of water, April was long out of breath. She was seeing shooting stars and black spots that weren't really there. It was the last thing she remembered before blackness pressed around her like a thick, furry pelt. When April awoke, the log was no longer moving. "Good, that's good," she muttered. She had no idea how long she had been unawares. April struggled to her knees and cautiously peeked outside. She blinked to clear her eyes and pulled back inside, like a turtle retreating into its shell. She counted to 10, pinched herself, and stuck her head out a second time. She pulled it back in a second time. April said, and settled down in her log to think. At least she seemed to have lost all her grubby logmates to the waterfall. Nothing crawled on her or around her. Okay, something was different. No, everything was different. Maybe she was dreaming. Yes, that would explain things. The log was lodged against the shore in a tangle of branches. The river was calm, and it was still daylight, but it wasn't winter anymore. It was summer. The air felt lovely and warm. The trees were fully dressed in leaves, although they looked smaller than normal, as if they had shrunk. Colorful flowers decorated the shore, and they looked bigger than normal. Everything was green and bright and fragrantly sweet, and summery. The situation definitely required further investigation. April wrapped her dripping scrap of fur tightly around her shoulders. She stumbled out of the log and across the branches to the shore. She dug her toes into the mud. It felt so warm and squishy, and real, not dreamlike at all. Had she somehow slept for 4 months and awoken in a different season? In a daze, April ventured farther. The unusual landscape was gentler than the forest she knew, and many things were smaller, not just the trees. In contrast, the flowers and ground vegetation grew bigger, towering high over April's 5 inches of height. The place she had ended up made no logical sense. The strangeness scared April, even while it did not seem threatening. She stopped moving, closed her eyes and concentrated hard to magically check the surrounding woodland. April strained to sense any large or dangerous creatures within range. There was nothing. Nothing to worry about at all. Worried anyway, she resumed her trek. An hour later, it was still summer. The sky was as blue as it could possibly be. Chirping, buzzing insects serenaded her ears. A balmy breeze wove through the trees and seemed to tickle her skin with tingly, invisible fingers. April became so warm that she abandoned her clammy skunk fur on the ground. "You must be having the best dream in the world," April remarked, when she stumbled into a meadow that was overflowing with ripe red strawberries. Except it all felt much too real to be a dream. April picked a berry, and she could feel its warmth in her hand. She bit into it and could taste its juicy sweetness. This was no dream. The berries were so plentiful that she could stand in one spot and eat her fill. She must have eaten 3 whole strawberries before her stomach protested. It was not used to so much food at one time. "What now?" April said, and stood in the middle of the berry field, hands on her hips, unsure what to do next. "Keep going," she answered herself. It was good advice. It was always safer to stay on the move. She crossed the field and ducked under cover into the thicker vegetation, trying a new direction. The vegetation thinned again almost immediately, and there was another meadow on the opposite side, and more than that. So much more. April fell back into the weeds and hid, as her heart tried to escape from her chest. Were her eyes playing tricks on her? Directly ahead loomed a solid, square structure built from stones. It was enormous, while still elf-sized, judging by the doors and the evenly spaced round windows that ran the length of the building. It was a permanent dwelling, yet elves never built permanent dwellings. What creature had constructed the organized arrangement of stones? The structure was surrounded by an inviting carpet of moss. It was edged on one side by a small, sparkling lake. April studied the dwelling closely. She spotted flickers of movement inside the windows. She was about to magically check what was within the structure when a resounding gong echoed across the meadow. She nearly jumped out of her skin. It must have been some sort of signal. The largest door flew open and a flood of real elves poured out, carrying sacks. April instinctively took another step backwards. She crouched low when her knees almost failed her. "Elves," she whispered in awe. "I can see elves. Elves." She wanted to keep saying it. The meadow filled up with energetic elves, beautifully dressed in all the colors of the rainbow. April had never seen so many different kinds of clothes, from casual shorts to pretty skirts, and even robes. Their hair and teeth gleamed in the sunlight, as if they brushed them vigorously each and every day. They all seemed to be within several years of April's own age. Was this strange place populated by only young elves? The elves settled onto the grass and opened sacks of food. It looked like eating time. April tried to count them, but there were too many bodies, and they didn't stay still. She guessed that there were more than 300 elves, more elves than had ever existed in her world, even before it was destroyed. "Elves," April repeated, one more time. Saying it made her smile, something that hadn't happened to her face in years. She kept watching, enthralled. After they ate, the elves ran around in the meadow, yelling and laughing. Some played games, others waded in the lake. They looked so happy. There was no attempt to hide, it was as if they feared nothing. In April's world, elves had perfected the art of never being seen or heard. It was the only way to survive, and all too often, it had not been enough. Why did these elves behave so recklessly? April could have been a forest cat, crouched in the shrubbery, stalking them, plotting to pounce. A second gong sounded and every last elf picked up their pack and filed back inside the structure. The meadow suddenly seemed so quiet. April felt hollow inside now that the elves were gone, as if they had never existed. Overwhelmed with the need to follow them, April rose and took one step forward, but not a second. She could not introduce herself in her present state. She didn't even have any clothes. April had sort of forgotten about clothes after 5 years alone in the forest. She only wore fur or leaves when it was cold. "You are a mess, you need to clean up," she advised herself in a shaky voice. That's what she would do, go back and find her fur, and tidy up as best she could. And she had better fix her hair. Thanks to the waterfall, it was hanging down to her ankles in a tangled curtain. From what she had just witnessed, these elves took very good care of their hair, and every other part of themselves. Yes, she would clean up and introduce herself properly. It was a good plan. It might have worked if she hadn't been careless, because she was so excited about finally finding other elves. April stepped out of the undergrowth, on the side hidden from the stone structure. She had assumed that all the elves were inside it. She had assumed wrong. "Ugh!" everyone yelled at once. It was hard to tell who was more shocked, April or the 3 elves who almost ran her over.